Somewhere in the high desert of the American Southwest, a 5-story stone city sits empty. Its walls are still standing, its rooms are still intact. Its great ceremonial chambers are still carved into the earth exactly the way they were left. But the people who built it walked away almost 800 years ago, and they never came back. That single fact has kept archaeologists arguing for over a century, and the newest evidence is only making the argument sharper, not simpler. The civilization at the center of this story is usually called the Anasazi, though that name itself carries a complicated history worth understanding before we go any further. Anasazi is a Navajo word, and its most common translation is ancient enemies, or enemy ancestors. It was adopted by early Anglo-American archaeologists in the early 1900s because Navajo guides and workers were among their main sources of local knowledge, and the term stuck in scientific literature for decades. The problem is that the descendants of these people, the modern Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo communities, do not call their own ancestors enemies, and many find the label uncomfortable or outright offensive. The Hopi prefer their own term, Hisatsinam, meaning the ancient ones or the people of long ago. Because of this, most archaeologists today use the term Ancestral Puebloans instead, a name that acknowledges the direct, unbroken cultural line between these ancient builders and the Pueblo nations who live in the Southwest today. Both terms will come up in this script, but it is worth knowing from the outset that this is not a story about a vanished, mysterious, lost civilization in the pop culture sense. It is a story about the direct ancestors of people who are very much still here, still practicing pieces of the same traditions, and still deeply invested in how their history gets told. The story begins roughly 2,000 years ago, when small groups of hunter-gatherers in the Four Corners region, the area where Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico meet, started shifting toward a settled agricultural way of life. They grew corn, beans, and squash, the same 3 staple crops grown across much of ancient North America, and over centuries they moved from simple pit houses dug into the earth toward more permanent above-ground construction. This earliest phase is generally called the basket maker period, named for the exceptional basket weaving skills preserved in the dry desert environment. By around 750 CE, the basket maker culture had evolved into what archaeologists call the Pueblo period, marked by the construction of true above-ground rooms built from stone and adobe, arranged in blocks that would eventually grow into the multi-story complexes the culture became famous for. The center of gravity for this entire civilization, at least for a few centuries, was Chaco Canyon, a stretch of high desert in what is now northwestern New Mexico. Between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, Chaco Canyon became the ceremonial, political, and economic hub of the entire ancestral Puebloan world. The scale of what they built there is genuinely staggering once you understand the constraints they were working under. This is an arid canyon with no local timber to speak of, yet the people of Chaco quarried sandstone blocks and hauled enormous timber beams from forests dozens of miles away. Some estimates suggest over 60 miles, using nothing but human labor. With those materials, they built at least 15 major complexes, known today as the Great Houses. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of them, contained several hundred rooms and stood 4 or 5 stories tall in places. Until steel frame construction arrived in the 19th century, buildings of this size were essentially unmatched anywhere else in North America. What makes Chaco especially interesting to researchers isn't just the size of these buildings, but the apparent purpose behind parts of them. Many rooms inside the great houses show no evidence that anyone ever lived in them. Some have no doors, no windows, and no space for a fire. Archaeologists now believe a significant number of these rooms weren't housing at all, but were built purely to add mass and visual grandeur to the structure, a kind of architectural statement of power and permanence rather than practical living space. Alongside the great houses, Chaco's builders carved enormous circular ceremonial chambers into the ground called kivas, some large enough to hold hundreds of people, with roofs constructed from horizontal timber courses supported by stone pilasters, engineered to look like an upside-down woven basket from the inside. Then there are the roads. Radiating out from Chaco Canyon is a network of engineered roadways, some running dead straight for tens of miles, regardless of the terrain in their path, cutting through hills and mesas rather than curving around them. Some of these roads appear to lead to smaller outlying communities, tying a huge swath of the Four Corners region into a single interconnected system. But other roads simply end in the open desert, connected to nothing. Archaeologists still debate what these roads were actually for. The straightforward explanation is trade and transportation, moving goods, timber, and people between Chaco and its satellite communities. But the roads that go nowhere have pushed many researchers toward a different explanation, that at least some of this network served a ceremonial or symbolic function, mapping out cosmological ideas about the layout of the world rather than practical travel routes. Some researchers have gone further, proposing what's called the Chaco Meridian theory, the idea that Chaco Canyon, the later Aztec ruins to the north, and the Paquime site far to the south in modern Mexico were deliberately built along the same line of longitude, representing a kind of shifting capital that moved south over centuries as political power relocated. This remains a contested idea, not a settled fact, but it illustrates just how sophisticated the reasoning behind Chaco construction may have been. Chaco's builders were also careful astronomers. Several structures at the site are aligned to solar and lunar events, including the sun's position at the solstices, and, in at least one documented case, a roughly 19-year lunar cycle. This wasn't decoration. In a farming society entirely dependent on predicting seasonal change, tracking the sky accurately was a matter of survival, and Chaco's builders encoded that knowledge directly into their architecture. Daily life inside this system looked very different depending on where you stood in it. The great houses themselves were likely home to a relatively small number of people, possibly religious or political leaders in their households, while the majority of the population lived in smaller settlements scattered across the canyon and the surrounding region, farming the canyon floor using check dams, terraces, and diversion channels engineered to catch and direct the scarce rainfall toward their fields. This kind of water management took real planning and communal labor, since a single hard rain in the desert can either save a harvest or wash it away entirely depending on how well the land has been prepared. Corn remained the dietary backbone, supplemented by beans, squash, and wild-gathered foods, along with turkeys, which were domesticated in the region primarily for their feathers rather than as a major food source, though turkey remains do show up occasionally in the archaeological record as part of the diet. For roughly 3 centuries, this was the beating heart of an enormous cultural and trade network. Turquoise, worked shell from the Pacific coast, macaw feathers, and even live scarlet macaws traded up from Mesoamerica, and cacao residue found in ceramic vessels all point to trade connections stretching thousands of miles. Then, starting around 1150 CE, construction at Chaco slowed and eventually stopped. Within another century, the canyon's great houses were essentially empty. Modern survey technology has also reshaped how researchers understand the scale of this network. Aerial and satellite imaging, along with ground-based remote sensing methods that can detect subtle soil and vegetation differences invisible at eye level, have revealed additional stretches of roadway and previously unrecorded small sites scattered across the wider San Juan Basin. This means the map of the Chacoan world has actually grown over the past few decades of research, not shrunk, as archaeologists identify more outlying communities that were linked, however loosely, into Chaco's orbit. It's a reminder that even after more than a century of formal excavation, this is not a closed book. New fieldwork and new analytical techniques keep adding detail to the picture rather than confirming a fixed, final story. Roughly the same pattern played out slightly later and slightly to the north, at Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado. Here, instead of open canyon floor construction, Ancestral Puebloans built directly into natural alcoves in sandstone cliffs, creating the iconic cliff dwellings the region is famous for today, including Cliff Palace, with more than 150 rooms tucked beneath an overhanging cliff face. Mesa Verde's population appears to have grown even as Chaco declined, suggesting some kind of shift in political or religious gravity from one center to the other, before Mesa Verde itself was abandoned by around 1300 CE. The cliff dwellings there weren't simply picturesque. The alcove locations offered natural insulation from summer heat and winter cold, protection from the elements, and, later in the occupation, a degree of natural defensibility that ground-level pueblos on the mesa top didn't provide. Building materials had to be carried down into the alcoves, and construction had to work around the uneven natural rock, which makes the level of architectural planning at sites like Cliff Palace and Balcony House even more impressive given the constraints. So what actually happened? Why did people who had built some of the most sophisticated architecture in North America, developed intensive irrigation systems, tracked the movement of the sun and moon with precision, and maintained trade routes running for 1,000 miles, simply walk away from their cities and never return? For most of the 20th century, the dominant explanation was drought, specifically a documented severe dry period across the Colorado Plateau in the late 1200s, sometimes called the Great Drought, identified through tree ring records. The logic is straightforward. A population that had grown large by relying on unusually favorable rainfall in earlier centuries would have been extremely vulnerable when that rainfall pattern broke down. Combined with topsoil erosion and the depletion of nearby farmland after centuries of continuous use, a serious drought could plausibly have made large-scale habitation of the region simply unsustainable. A closely related theory focuses on deforestation and environmental overuse rather than drought alone. Research analyzing pollen and plant remains from Chaco Canyon has shown that the local pinyon and juniper woodlands were being harvested for construction timber and fuel for many centuries before Chaco's decline, and that these slow-growing woodlands were substantially depleted by the height of the Chacoan building boom. The idea here is that Chaco's own success sowed the seeds of its later fragility, stripping the immediate landscape of resources needed for construction, fuel, and long-term ecological stability, so that when climate conditions worsened, there was much less of a buffer to absorb the shock. For years, this deforestation-driven collapse was cited widely, including by modern environmental writers, as a cautionary tale about unsustainable resource use. More recent research has pushed back hard on treating either drought or deforestation as a simple, complete explanation. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, conducted by researchers at the University of New Mexico, examined the evidence for large-scale resource overuse at Chaco and concluded that it doesn't hold up as a standalone explanation for collapse the way it's often presented. Other researchers studying the caloric costs of food, fuel gathering, and infrastructure across different periods of Chacoan history have focused on a different question entirely. Not what the environment was doing to the population, but how expensive, in terms of raw human labor and energy, it became to sustain population growth and monumental construction over time. In other words, some of the pressure on the system may have come from the internal cost of maintaining a hierarchical, labor-intensive society, not only from external climate shocks. There's also a harder, more unsettling body of evidence that complicates the picture further. Signs of violence, and in a small number of well-studied cases, cannibalism. The most famous example comes from a site called Cowboy Wash, near Sleeping Ute Mountain in southwestern Colorado, where researchers found human remains bearing cut marks, breakage patterns, and other taphonomic evidence consistent with the processing of human bodies for consumption, evidence significant enough to be published in the journal Nature. It's important to be precise about what this evidence does and does not show. It does not establish that cannibalism was common or central to ancestral Puebloan life generally. What it appears to reflect, according to most researchers who study it, is a period of severe social stress, possibly tied to conflict, famine, or the breakdown of social order, concentrated in specific places and times rather than a defining feature of the culture as a whole. The interpretation remains genuinely debated among specialists, some pointing to warfare and social collapse, others raising alternative explanations involving ritual practice or extreme circumstance, and the debate itself has been going on unresolved for roughly 4 decades. Presenting this evidence as proof of a dark, hidden truth about the ancestral Puebloans as a people would be a distortion of what the research actually shows. It is one difficult data point from specific, isolated locations during a documented period of upheaval, not a verdict on an entire civilization. Alongside this evidence for episodic violence, archaeologists have also found watchtowers, defensive wall placements, and settlement patterns that shifted toward more easily defended locations, like the cliff alcoves at Mesa Verde, in the period leading up to the final migrations. Taken together with the climate and resource pressures already described, a more layered picture emerges. Not a single dramatic cause, but a combination of worsening drought, resource strain built up over centuries, and increasing social and political instability, all compounding at roughly the same time. Modern archaeology tends to treat the old, tidy explanations like they were wiped out by drought, or they overused the land and it collapsed, as oversimplified. The current consensus leans toward a slow, multi-causal unraveling rather than one single catastrophic event. Tree ring science, formerly known as dendrochronology, has actually been one of the most reliable tools researchers have for pinning down the timing of all this, because trees in this region lay down a distinct growth ring every year. And because those rings are thinner in dry years and thicker in wet ones, scientists can build a year-by-year rainfall record stretching back well over 1,000 years, cross-referencing that record against the wooden roof beams still preserved in the region's dry climate inside the ruins themselves. That's how researchers know with real precision, not just that a major drought hit the northern southwest in the second half of the 1200s, but roughly how severe and how prolonged it was compared to droughts before and after it. It's a genuinely elegant piece of science, and it's part of why the drought explanation, even though it's now understood as one factor among several rather than the single cause, was never simply invented or exaggerated. The tree ring record is real, well-documented, and consistent across many independent sites. And crucially, this was not an extinction. It was a migration. The people did not disappear so much as relocate, and figuring out exactly where they went has been one of the more productive areas of recent research. Oral histories from multiple modern Pueblo communities, as well as several Diné or Navajo clans, describe ancestral ties running back to Chaco Canyon and the broader Four Corners region. For a long time, though, this connection between the ancient sites and specific living communities was treated by outside researchers as historically plausible but scientifically unproven, since the human remains excavated from sites like Pueblo Bonito over a century ago taken without tribal consent and shipped to museums like the American Museum of Natural History, had, in some cases, been classified as culturally unidentifiable, meaning institutions could not formally connect them to any living tribal nation. That started to change through a recent genetic study involving the Pueblo, a small tribal nation in northern New Mexico. Members of the tribe worked with an archaeologist who had spent more than 3 decades in partnership with the community, and together they pursued genomic analysis comparing ancient DNA from Chaco Canyon with the DNA of modern and ancestral people. This was not an easy decision for the tribe. There was a real possibility that the results could come back showing no genetic connection at all, undermining oral traditions the community had held for generations. Instead, the analysis found a genetic link between the Pueblo and the population that once lived at Chaco Canyon, offering the kind of direct scientific evidence for these long-standing oral histories that had not previously existed. This is a meaningful moment in the field, not because it was unexpected by the descendant communities themselves, who had never really doubted their own history, but because it gives that history a form of validation within Western scientific frameworks that can carry weight in legal and policy discussions about land, heritage sites, and repatriation of ancestral remains. Beyond the Pueblo's connection, the broader pattern of migration out of the Chaco and Mesa Verde regions appears to have flowed primarily southward and eastward, toward the northern Rio Grande Valley in what is now New Mexico, as well as toward the Hopi Mesas in Arizona and Zuni territory further south. This isn't a single, neat theory, though. It remains an area of active research, and the exact routes, timing, and social dynamics of these migrations are still being worked out site by site. What is well established is the destination side of the story. The Hopi, Zuni, and the various Rio Grande Pueblo nations, including Picuris, Taos, San Ildefonso, and many others, all maintain living cultural and, increasingly, documented genetic threads back to the people who built Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Their descendants didn't vanish into history. They became the modern Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest, and many of their ceremonial practices, architectural traditions, and oral histories carry forward elements that researchers can trace directly back to these ancient sites. There's one more thread worth pulling on here because it says something about how archaeology as a discipline has changed. 100 years ago, excavation at these sites was often closer to treasure hunting than modern science, with little regard for preservation standards or, more importantly, for the wishes of the descendant communities whose ancestors were being dug up and studied. That history has left real tension. Some indigenous people from Pueblo, Navajo, Hopi, and other nations connected to this region are reluctant to discuss the ancient culture publicly at all, treating certain places and practices as sacred and not meant for outside consumption. Today, the more responsible end of southwestern archaeology involves active, ongoing collaboration between researchers and tribal nations, including projects like the Pueblo genetic study, where the descendant community itself chose to initiate the research and controlled how the results were used. That collaborative model doesn't make for the flashiest headlines, but it's a far more accurate description of where serious archaeological work on this culture stands today than any framing built around forbidden secrets or civilizations that terrify scientists. It's also worth pointing out how much of what we now understand about this culture has changed even within the last 20 or 30 years, and how much is still shifting. The framing of a single great drought as the tidy explanation for abandonment was the dominant textbook answer for most of the 20th century. The recognition that woodland depletion and resource strain played a compounding role came later, as pollen and macrobotanical analysis techniques improved. The recognition that violence and social breakdown were part of the picture in specific times and places came through advances in forensic-style analysis of skeletal remains. And the direct genetic link between Chaco Canyon and a living Pueblo nation is only a very recent development, arriving through a research partnership built on trust that took decades to establish. Each of these pieces arrived through slow, careful, often collaborative work, not through a single dramatic discovery. That's simply how this kind of science tends to progress, in increments, with older explanations getting revised rather than thrown out wholesale as new evidence comes in. So where does that leave the actual mystery, stripped of exaggeration? It's this: a society that built engineering and astronomical achievements rivaling anything else in pre-contact North America, sustained a trade network stretching 1,000 miles, and organized itself around monumental ceremonial architecture, went through a complex, decades-long unraveling driven by climate stress, resource strain, and social upheaval. And its people didn't vanish, but scattered and rebuilt elsewhere, carrying pieces of that culture forward into the present day. That's not a lesser story than the sensational one. If anything, it's a more useful one, because it's a story about resilience and continuity as much as it is about collapse, and because the people at the center of it are not a mystery to be solved from the outside. They're still here, And increasingly, they're the ones leading the research into their own past. The honest version of this story doesn't need embellishment to hold your attention. A civilization that engineered solar observatories into stone kivas, built roads that ran arrow straight through the desert for reasons still debated by specialists, and left behind descendants who can now trace their DNA back to the builders of Pueblo Bonito, doesn't need invented drama layered on top of it. What terrifies careful researchers isn't some hidden horror buried in the ruins. It's the risk of getting the story wrong, of flattening 1,000 years of complex, documented human history into a clickbait headline that erases the living people this history actually belongs to. If you ever get the chance to actually stand inside Chaco Canyon, or under the overhanging cliffs at Mesa Verde, or walking the excavated rooms at Aztec ruins to the north, the scale of it tends to land differently than any description can manage. These aren't reconstructions or artist impressions. The masonry is original. The kiva walls are original. In places, the wooden roof beams overhead are the same beams placed there by hand 800 or 900 years ago, with thin rings of tree growth still visible in the wood, marking out the exact wet and dry years. Those trees lived through before they were cut down and hauled in from forests miles away. Walking through that kind of space tends to strip away whatever exaggerated framing got you interested in the first place, and replace it with something quieter and, honestly, more affecting. A very real sense of just how much human effort, knowledge, and organization went into a place that its builders eventually had to leave behind for reasons that were almost certainly practical, difficult, and deeply human, rather than mysterious in the way sensational headlines like to suggest.